Welcome everybody to chesslecture.com. This is your host, International Master John Paul Wallace. Now we're continuing looking at a fantastic battle in our epic battle series between Mikhail Tal, former world champion, and the very strong Icelandic Grandmaster Jóhann Hartison. And we've reached a position after Black's 30th move, Rook A8. Now, Tal's managed to tie Hartison up in knots. He's achieved a number of positional advantages. His knight on A5 is a thorn in Black's side. He can also jump from A5 to C6. Tal also has the C file in order to pressurize the Black position. And that bishop on H6 is actually quite irritating for Black. It's not really in danger of being trapped. Black can't really get to it, and it sort of weakens Black's king a little bit, gives White some tactical opportunities. Now Tal made a shifty little maneuver here. He played Queen C2, Knight C to E8, and Queen B3. He just wanted to give Hartison something to think about. Now, if in some positions it will work to play Knight takes E5, D takes E5, D6 check, and then take the bishop on E7. It's not on at the moment because after D6 check, Black has bishop E6 hitting the Queen, but it's a sort of annoying thing that is an extra thing to worry about or think about when you're playing Black. So Hartison decided to take care of that one straight away by playing bishop F6. Tal infiltrated with Knight C6. And now Hartison played Knight H5, which is a good move. Now Black's got a couple of ideas. The Knight on H5 can even jump into G3 because there's a pin. Maybe he would like to play bishop G7 to swap off that bishop on H6. Now Tal played Queen B2 at this point, already having in mind a fantastic tactical blow which he hit with on two moves later. He's already planning it. As we'll see, that Queen on B2 is an essential part of White's setup. Now again, I'd like to read from you Mikhail Tal's own words. Black played bishop G7 here, and Mikhail Tal comments thus. He says, "Convinced that the sacrifice on E5 is not dangerous, Black realizes the advantageous strategic decision of exchanging black squared bishops, overlooking a combinational blow." Now this is something I mentioned earlier, that Mikhail Tal, behind the scenes, so to speak, with brilliant tactical nuances, was actually gaining strategic advantages from Hartison. Now here, he understands that Hartison wants to play bishop G7 because from a positional point of view it's in his best interests. However, what Tal's done is he's set it up so that when he does play bishop G7 it'll actually be a bad move due to tactical reasons, combinational reasons. That takes a lot of genius to do that. So therefore Tal mentions that on this move 34, Rook C8 or King H8 were better options. He says after that, White's position remains better, but a clear advantage is still far off. By the way, during the game I remember two defeats in similar positions, against Spassky, 9th game of our match in 1965, and against Jansa, who we mentioned earlier, in Part A, Sarajevo in 1966. In both cases, White seemed to make progress on the Queen side, but Black's counterplay turned out to be quick and effective. Now captures on G7, and Hartison played King takes G7, seemingly oblivious to the danger. The problem was that already there was tactical problems throughout the position. For example, if he had played Knight E takes G7, White plays a brilliant move, King H2. The threat is Queen E2, and the pawn on B5 is dropping off. Now the reason King H2 has to be played first is if Queen E2 immediately, here comes that tricky little Knight G3 move and the Queen has to move again. So I would start with king h2 and win a pawn. If knight on h5 takes g7, black would just end up with a very passive position with both of his knights in defensive situations. However, this would still have been the best choice. At least tactically his position is sound enough. King takes g7 was played, and I'm sure Hjaltason must have been looking at white sacrificing knights on e5 here, but he must have calculated that it's all good. What he didn't expect to happen was what Tal came up with, which was a brilliant move. If we have a look at knight f takes e5, for example, pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, hitting the bishop on d7 and opening up a line from b2 to g7 against the king, then queen f6, countering the diagonal and also putting the knight in the pin of itself, so you can't take on d7 because the queen takes b2. So Hjaltason probably planned something like that, but he wasn't exactly expecting Tal's brilliant move, rook c5. Rook c5 here, on move 36 is the crux of the combination. Now Tal already had this position in his head when he played queen b2, and he's actually gained himself a winning position through that move. He's threatening just to simply capture a pawn with rook takes b5. If bishop takes c6 here, then rook takes c6, and white has a strategically won position. He's just infiltrating. Pawn on d6 is weak, pawn on b5 is weak. Now let's see what would have happened if Hjaltason accepted the rook sacrifice. D takes c5. White would play knight f takes e5. No, he's threatening to win the queen with knight takes d7 check. Discovered check, and it picks up the queen on b6. Maybe you could go queen a6 here, so you don't lose your queen. But after knight takes d7 check, king h6, white could even just take another pawn, b takes c5. Because even if black gets an endgame with the exchange up, queen a1, queen a1, rook a1 check, king h2, black has a hopeless position, because those pawns on c5 and d5 are just going to rage up the board. White has 3 passed pawns, whereas black's passed pawn on b5 is easily dropping off. So Tal's Hjaltason's situation is very difficult, but he found the best move after rook c5, queen a6. It's a clever move, because if bishop takes b5, now queen a1 check will work. And then black captures the rook on c5 with a winning position. So Tal had to take with the rook, and then Hjaltason plays knight c7, so he's trying to win material in a safer way. The rook on b5 moves. Black wants to go and take that bishop on d3. Black can't take on e5 here because of queen a1 check as well. However, there was a very interesting alternative here. After rook takes b5, if Hjaltason had first captured on c6, let's take a look at that. Bishop takes c6, d takes c6, knight c7. If rook b7, which appears to be good, move 39, queen takes c6. On the other hand, rook d5 also doesn't achieve the aim, because queen a1 check, queen takes a1, rook takes a1 check, king h2, take the rook, he takes d5, and now knight rushes back to f6. Black will manage to stop those pawns, blockade those queenside pawns of white's. Wherever there is a win there, Tal had one prepared. Bishop takes c6, d takes c6, knight c7, Rook a5. Brilliant move. Queen takes d3, so white's sacrificing a bishop, but he's putting his money on his two passed pawns, one of them only 2 squares away from queening. Rook takes a8, knight takes a8, queen a1. And this move assures white of the win. If knight c7 or knight b6, white has queen a7, and that knight on c7 is dropping off with check, and then white's going to win thanks to that advanced pawn on c6, which is now just 2 squares away from promotion. On the other hand, after rook a5, in this position, queen takes c6. If this, then white has... It's amazing how he just seems to use all the tactics in the position. White has knight takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes e5 check, followed by rook on a5 now to c5. For example, knight f6, rook c5, hitting the queen, and next move rook takes c7 check, picking up that knight on c7. Tal just seems to make all the tactics just work for him. It's incredible. However, there is a general rule that should be remembered, which is that when you have a very strong position from a strategic point of view, all of your pieces on good squares, then the tactics tend to flow. Now there are exceptions to that, but generally speaking it's a pretty good rule. So after rook takes b5, black played knight c7. Now it's not so clear what Tal's going to do. The rook on b5 is under attack. If it moves, then queen takes d3. And the maneuver rook a5, queen takes d3, rook a8, knight a8, queen a1, which we just looked at, that doesn't work if black hasn't swapped on c6. White doesn't have a passed pawn on c6 here. So Tal has to find a completely different way to break through. Otherwise he's basically material down with no compensation. But he does find a brilliant way. He hasn't forgotten to play on both sides of the board. He plays on the queen side, and yet he's also somehow indirectly getting threats against the black king. And that's what he does with his next move, rook b8. On b8, the rook is actually starting a mating net against the black king. It's the crux of white's combination. The queen on a6 is under attack from the bishop on d3, so black has to accept the sacrifice. Queen takes d3. But now knight c takes e5. Another sacrifice. And now that queen on b2 again lined up against the king on g7. Black's position starting to fall apart now. If d takes e5, queen takes e5 check. Black threw in a check on d1, king h2, and now he went for his own mating attack with rook a1. Probably worth a try. There was a forced win if d takes e5 in any case. Now queen takes e5 check. This is what could have happened if black accepted the sacrifice on move 40. d e5, queen e5 check, king h6. Queen g5 check, king g7, queen e7 check, king h6, queen f8 check, knight g7, queen takes f4 check, and it's mate on the next move after king h5, queen g5 mate, or queen h4 mate. It's a brilliant, it would have been a brilliant end. But after queen d1 check, king h2, rook a1 was played. I mean, black could have played queen a1 here just to swap off queens, but I mean the position's hopeless. Just swap off on queen takes a1, rook takes a1, knight takes d7. White's 2 pawns up and past b pawn. Just that's ready to queen. That's just hopeless. So there'd be no point playing that. It'd almost be a bit of an insult to Tal for his brilliant game. You may as well go out with a bang. So Hjaltason played rook a1. And now knight g4 check comes, and as you can see, that rook on b8 actually perfectly positioned to checkmate the black king. Black knight g4 is a good move because now the king can't go to h6. Black can't play knight f6 to defend it because white's got 2 pieces on it. So king f7 is forced. White played knight h6 check. King e7. Now Tal played knight g8 check here, and Hjaltason resigned because if king f7, knight g5 is mate. But Tal also cheekily points out that queen g7 check wasn't a bad move either. Knight takes g7, knight g8 check, king f7, knight g5 check. Same position, except you just happen to sacrifice your queen. Still mate. That was a fantastic game, and one of the all-time great Roy Lopez games. Every world champion seems to add something new to the Roy Lopez, and Tal just has the gift of combinations. And as you can see in that game, at a higher level, at the Grandmaster level, the way that he smashes a lot of these guys is he doesn't necessarily go straight for the killer combination, but his skills refined over the years, and obviously against high quality opposition you can't always just go straight for the smash. So what he managed to do was use his brilliant tactical ability to tie them down, to squeeze them and to send their pieces into passive positions. Sometimes those tactics, as I recommend you replay through the game, especially some of the tactics in the part A of the video. Part B was more of a direct, this is how we smash him once we've got the attack. But in part A you'll notice how he uses little tactical nuances to tie Hjaltason up in knots, to gain a positional edge over him, to gain his pieces on better squares than Hjaltason's positions. He actually uses tactics in an indirect way, not for a kingside attack, but to gain a positional advantage. And I'll leave you with Tal's final comment, which is to remember that the real hero in this game was his queen's knight. It started on b1, and instead of going from d2 to f1 to g3, which is a standard Roy Lopez knight maneuver, Tal says, remember the route of the principal hero in this game. My knight went from d2 to f1 to e3 to c2 to a1, from there to b3 to a5 to c6 to e5 to g4 to h6, and finally the last move in the game, knight g8, setting up the mate. So that's one hell of a knight maneuver. So I hope you all enjoyed that. It's certainly one of my all-time favourite games. I just love the combination of using tactics to gain a positional edge in the first part of the game, and then just a brilliant display of aggression in the final part of the game to set up a mating attack. So I look forward to your feedback on that game. This is International Master John Paul Wallace for ChessLecture.com. Thank you.